universe and the human mind do not each separately cause the absurd, but rather the absurd arises by the contradictory nature of the two existing simultaneously. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I cannot know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that I understand. The myth of Sisyphus explores the value of life in a world devoid of religious meaning. His work can be seen as a reply to Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. He calls the absurd, which we all live in, to be sin without God. However, Camus does not consider himself as an atheist. He states, "I do not believe in God, and I am not an atheist." This reflects the notion of the absurd. The search of the possibility of the existence of God is humanly impossible, but this also entails that the proof that God does not exist is impossible too. He writes, "In a universe certainly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is probably the feeling of absurdity." The book declares that within the limit of nihilism, it is possible to find the means to proceed beyond nihilism, embracing the absurd. It sums itself as a lucid invitation to live and to create in the very midst of the desert. The way out of despair is to reaffirm the value of personal existence and the possibility of life lived with authenticity. The problem of suicide must be met face to face, he states. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. One answer to the absurd is physical suicide, which tends to happen without going through reflection. One evening, the person pulls the trigger and jumps. Killing oneself is a sort of confession that life is too much, that it is incomprehensible, or that it is not worth the trouble. He links this to what he calls the feeling of absurdity, closely tied to the feeling that life is meaningless. And the act of suicide is linked to the idea that life is not worth living. Thus, dying voluntarily implies the absence of any profound reason for living and the uselessness of suffering. However, there are plenty of contradictions. Those who commit suicide might be assured life has a meaning, and those who feel life is not worth living still continue to live. Camus believes that our instinct for life is much stronger than our reasons for suicide. Avoiding the full consequences of the meaningless nature of life through an act of eluding, commonly manifesting itself as hope. Physical suicide is never an option for the absurd man. Much like the leap of faith, it is an acceptance at its extreme. It would be a way of going along with our absurd condemnation by implicitly affirming that life is really intolerably absurd and that suicide is our only option. The difference between an absurd man and an ordinary man is that the absurd man gets more out of life because his detachment comes from a heightened awareness that makes him more open to experiences. An absurd worldview is one that abandons values, one that rests content with description and does not seek explanation or justification. Through the examples of the seducer, the actor, the conqueror, and the artist, it becomes clear that the absurd man lives out a kind of show. He lives only as if he were fully committed to what he's doing. He carries out his days willingly and lives without appeal, as Camus puts it. Camus also talks about philosophical suicide. One of the most common forms of escaping the absurd is precisely believing in some ready-made belief system, practically all of the world's religion, where one accepts something as true that isn't convincing but is convenient and easy for him to believe in. It is any hypothetical belief system that immediately alleviates one from the meaningless void of existence, at the cost of committing a sort of mental suicide by shutting down one's mental faculties. The contrary of suicide for Camus is man condemned to death. Since we cannot evade death, we must entertain death, keep it busy. Man is in constant lucidity of his own absurd nature, with the passionate flames of human revolt. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. an absurd freedom, and to become lucid and conscious of it is to revolt, embracing a world devoid of meaning or purpose. Revolt is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man with the unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. Camus draws from the absurd three consequences. Revolt, we must not accept any answer or reconciliation in our struggle. Freedom, we are absolutely free to think and behave as we choose. And passion, we must pursue a life of rich and diverse experiences. Essentially, man is his own end, and he is his only end. If he aims to be something, it is in this life. The flames of earth are surely worth celestial perfumes. Another big part of the absurd is our daily existence. The absurd person is someone who has seen through the ridiculous repetitions of daily life. Rising streetcar, 4 hours in the office or factory. Meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work. Meal, sleep. And Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. He associates this condemnation to the mythological character of Sisyphus, a man who lived an immoral life and who is condemned by the gods to the worst punishment of all, a monotonous and repetitive task consisting of rolling a large boulder up a hill only to reach the top of the hill and have the boulder roll back to the bottom for him to start all over again and again and again for eternity, condemned to a life of pain only to have his efforts be completely insignificant in the end. And there's nothing he can do to change that situation, so he lives without appeal. For Camus, Sisyphus is the ideal absurd hero who lives life to the fullest, hates death, and is condemned to a meaningless task. This incredibly vivid imagery is an allegory of the human condition. It is our punishment to a futile search for meaning in an indifferent and meaningless universe. While working on the same mundane tasks, we all have to push our own boulders, only to watch it roll back down. What really makes our human existence absurd is our consciousness of our Sisyphean condemnation when we avoid the trap of philosophical and physical suicide. However, Camus does not encourage us to fall into despair. He imagines Sisyphus defiantly meeting his fate as he walks down the hill to begin rolling the rock again. When he is briefly free, when he is superior to his fate and stronger than his rock, he is thus not only a prisoner, but a rebel. Even if the daily struggles of our lives sometimes seem equally repetitive and absurd, we still give them significance and value by embracing them as our own. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The myth of Sisyphus tackles the colossal project of the meaning of life itself. However, Camus does not try to describe or explain it through metaphysics. He merely observes how we are occasionally struck by the feeling of absurdity. He wants us to follow his analysis of a state of mind we have all shared at one time or another, focusing solely on how we are to live and how we can be happy. For if there is a sin against life, it consists perhaps not so much in despairing of life as in hoping for another life and in eluding the implacable grandeur of this life.
What could Alexei... Existentialism. Let's check that out.
Philosophy is not very sexy. You ever see bearded bald bros sitting around a table in tweed jackets?
Pretty sexy to me.
And thought to yourself, are you boys a bunch of grocery store products? Because I got a cutout coupon to get in that ass. Yeah, me neither. But if there is one branch of philosophy that exudes a subtle sexual energy, it's existentialism. The school of thought cooked up by some stylish French folks while drinking cocktails and chain smoking at hip cafes throws away all that boring logic to think about radical freedom, responsibility, and a world without God. This makes it pretty attractive to those of us who prefer cafe life to library life. It's also why we've talked about it a ton over the years. So much of our favorite media explores ideas like freedom, identity, and a lack of consistent meaning.
Hey, if your mother and I had to split custody, who would you guys choose?
Doesn't matter.
And existentialism is the perfect tool to understand these deeper themes. But this unabashed love of French philosophy risks ignoring the fact that existentialism also has a lot of problems and a lot of critics, especially those who are suspicious of the idea that we all really have radical freedom. Existentialists have been criticized by other philosophers, writers, political theorists, and even theologians. But no one has been harsher on existentialism than the existentialists themselves. Which makes sense because aren't we all our harshest critics? So does existentialism still have a use in 2023? Do the thinkers who came up with the school of thought even stand by it? Or was it just a trendy moment fueled by day drinking? Let's find out in this wisecrack edition on existentialism, why it changed. So to really talk about existentialism, we need to go back a bit, as it emerged largely in response to some of the styles of thought that preceded it, most notably things like idealism and rationalism. Now, the very basic gist of both idealism and rationalism is that reality is an understandable structure that's knowable via reason. Think about someone like Descartes here. With idealism, especially of the German variety, this thinking goes further, arguing that there is a consistent and ideal structure that applies to both the objective world, which is, nature and the stuff that's outside of our humanity, and the subjective world, stuff like human consciousness. Now, essentially, your subjectivity shares the same DNA with objective reality, and the two can then be reconciled into one big thing by what Hegel calls the process of spirit. Now, importantly, if our consciousness and reality share the same structure, then everything becomes more or less knowable via reflective thinking. And I can do all of this from the comfort of my living room, which could lead to reflection being seen as more important than action. And thinking in terms of objective reason could be seen as more important than thinking about myself as a specific individual subject. Now, Kierkegaard was at university while this type of thinking was all the rage. And while he was influenced by idealism, he worried that this way of thinking treated life, existence, and individual subjectivity as conceptual structures to be understood in rational and logical terms. And he was especially worried that idealism was going to turn religion, which is something he thought of as grounded in faith, into something wholly logical. This led him to pivot away from objective reflection and towards an emphasis on subjective thinking and categories like the single individual, faith, and decision. For Kierkegaard, we can't just sit around and think about things all day in hopes of getting it right. We need to take risks and leaps of faith in creating our own subjectivity. And while not a self-proclaimed existentialist, Kierkegaard's work was the 19th century blueprint for what would follow. Also, if you want to learn more about Kierkegaard, illegally download my book on him. Don't pay money. It's good, but don't pay money to the publisher because they just stopped sending me money. I don't think it's a lot of money, but I would like to have that money. So if anyone wants to hit up anyone at Roman and Littlefield International Publishing and email them with the subject line, "Where is Burns' money?" I wouldn't be mad at you. That could be a fun thing for us to do, a little political action with your buddy Michael. Why not? And what followed was proper existentialism, a philosophical sensibility that emerged in Paris in the 1930s. Now, most of the earliest existentialists wrote not only formal academic work, but also plays and novels. Existentialism was particularly conducive to creative expression because it focused on the individual's lived experience, their passion, anxiety, and emotions. It's also why movies today still pull on these themes all the time. Now, the early crew of existentialists included folks like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. While all worthy of their own YouTube videos, let's start with Sartre, who famously gave the school of thought its initial motto: existence precedes essence. And in case you didn't know, in Drake's song, The Motto, that's what he's talking about. The idea here is that you are who you are, not because of any inherent or predetermined structures, but rather because of your very existence. And while this type of freedom can seem enticing, it's also anxiety-inducing because it means we are wholly responsible for who we are and what we do. Now, Sartre called the denial of this fundamental freedom bad faith, a sort of performative self-deception by which we try to act as if we aren't free. Like an Irish American saying, well, they just have to be a cop. Or Sartre's famous example, which is a waiter who acts as if waiting tables is his destiny. He simply is a waiter. Now, while much of this meshes with Kierkegaard, Sartre and his drinking buddies took things in a more godless direction, describing existentialism as nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. But this isn't the sort of angry 17-year-old atheism we talked about in our recent nihilism video. It's an ontological project of thinking through what it means if there is no God. Now, the same quote goes on to say, in this sense, existentialism is optimistic. It is a doctrine of action. Because if there is no God and it's just us, then we're responsible for what we make of ourselves and we're responsible for the creation of meaning. For example, we see this sort of vibe in recent films like Everything Everywhere All at Once and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, where there's not really a coherent, determined reality, and individual choices end up shaping both subjectivity and the world.
Everything is just a random rearrangement of particles in a vibrating superposition.
Now, for some, this brand of existentialism is attractive because it emphasizes our own freedom and responsibility. But others might see it as insufficient, lacking concern with concrete aspects of existence. Because surely someone born to a wealthy family in a developed country doesn't have the same type of freedom as an orphan living in poverty in the developing world. And it would be silly to say that we're all equally free when things like skin color, sexual orientation, and access to wealth can drastically determine our possibilities. And this is why the work of another existentialist, Simone de Beauvoir, is crucial. Now, she was more aware that biological and social factors can limit our subjectivity and freedom, which makes sense as the sole woman in the early crew of existentialists who lived in a world that was super duper patriarchal and misogynistic. So totally different than our own. In her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she explores the seeming contradiction between Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom and the constraints and limits of material circumstances. She writes that, however, man does not create the world. He succeeds in disclosing it only through the resistance which the world opposes to him. In other words, our free action is always carried out against the resistance of a world of facticity. For example, it's only when you can't afford the good cuts of the hog that you creatively figure out how to use the scraps to create the glorious hot dog. Shout out to our director Lux, who recently threw a hot dog party. If there's pictures of that party, I implore him to include one in this video. She went on to apply this thinking to a question that almost 100 years later, no one really cares about anymore: the distinction between sex and gender. I'm kidding, people care about it a lot, especially in America. It's not good, and there's better stuff to worry about, and it's just like, what are we doing? I think that's my attitude towards most of the political and cultural discourse in 2023. It's just like, what are we doing? And let me know in the comments, should we make a wisecrack shirt that's like, wisecrack, what are we doing? And then we'll make it. In her book, The Second Sex, she wrote that one is not born, but becomes a woman, basically applying the foundational motto of existentialism, that your existence precedes your essence, to the question of gender identity. And she argues that biological sex doesn't determine gender, which is something that is shaped via your existence. She goes on to outline why women are the second sex, as man has been the universal term used for humanity as such, i.e. when referring to humanity in general, we use the language of man.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
With woman being something that is other. This creates a social and political world in which women are always categorically in a secondary position, and they have to use men or adjacency to men to acquire power. In this way, de Beauvoir takes a more social and political lens to existentialism, acknowledging that radical freedom has limits, and that society is structured in ways that drastically determines the possibilities for those without universal identity, i.e. European men, a group that I was recently accused in the comments of a Wisecrack video of being racist against. This guy, racist against European white men. This project was furthered in the 1950s by Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and philosopher Frantz Fanon, who was also inspired by and friendly with Sartre and de Beauvoir. Now, it could be argued that Fanon further brought existentialist freedom into contradiction with the real world by applying it to questions of racism and colonization. Now, Richard Pitthouse describes Fanon's work as a combination of Sartrean existentialism and Marxism. In his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon described how blackness had been created as a wholly other category to that of whiteness, like de Beauvoir had done for woman as an otherness to man. He argued that a colonized black subject must use the language and culture of whiteness to gain social recognition. In other words, a black person must put on a white mask to gain their humanity in the eyes of the white colonizer. The solution to this, in so much as he outlines one, is basically creating a new humanism that transcends the foundation of whiteness and the otherness of blackness by just rejecting those racial hierarchies. As Fanon writes, we believe that an individual must endeavor to assume the universalism inherent in the human condition. In another text, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes that for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man. I.e., to truly have a universal humanity, it can't just be that everyone gets to participate in whiteness. We need to create something altogether new. So where does this leave Sartre? Did the more radical takes on existentialism by the likes of de Beauvoir and Fanon leave his work in the dust? Or was the old man able to keep up with the changing times? Well, in an interview from 1969, Sartre said that, "The other day I reread a prefatory note of mine to a collection of plays and was truly scandalized. I had written, whatever the circumstances and wherever the site, a man is always free to choose to be a traitor or not. When I read this, I said to myself, it's incredible. I actually believed that." He's saying that his previous emphasis on radical freedom went way too far in terms of not acknowledging the way in which material and social conditions limits this freedom, especially relative to political forces. Also, side note, I think it's a good sign when a philosopher is willing to change their mind and critique their older work, because like, you're really going to tell me you had an idea in your 20s and you're just going to repeat that idea forever? That shows me that someone's selling you a brand and not selling you a willingness to actively be thinking. So that's just one person's opinion. Now, in the years since writing his book Being and Nothingness and getting the whole existentialism ball rolling, Sartre had gone through a materialist transformation and realized that his early work lacked a proper account of the way that material, social, and economic forces place very real constraints on our freedom. And if you want to know more about this type of materialism, check out our recent video on Marx. Now, this led him to explore ideas around dialectics, and more specifically, Marxist materialism. Dialectics, which we find in Hegel, is the idea that thought develops via antagonism, and that ideas often have dialectical relationships, which basically mean that the productive force of thought is contradiction. But this doesn't mean that if you want to think ideas that you should just be a dick and just start debates. Not what it means, to be clear. Now, for example, we could say that the contradiction between the will of the masses and the rule of the monarchy leads to an idea like democracy. Building on this, Marxist materialism argues that it's the antagonism between humanity and the material world that shapes history, meaning that something like the wheel didn't emerge just because humans are super smart, but because they experienced a direct antagonism between their desire to move heavy stuff long distances and their inability to do so. Or like how the antagonism between wanting to drink beer and also wanting to use our hands led humans to develop a beer helmet. Also, if you're mad that I didn't just take out a beer helmet and put it on and you wish we had a budget for prop comedy at Wisecrack, consider joining our Patreon, because then we'll make more money and we could do prop comedy. And let us know if you sign up for Patreon that that's why you joined. You also get stuff like our videos early without ads. We have a Discord server. We make extra content. There's a link in the description. But I'll stop now. But think about it, me in a beer helmet, that could be us, but you playing. Sartre's interest in Marxism seems like a far cry from his Kierkegaardian days of radical freedom and subjectivity, as Marx was way more of a concrete social analysis guy than he was a radical leap of faith guy. In one of his later texts, Search for a Method, Sartre writes that, thus Marx, rather than Kierkegaard or Hegel, is right, since he asserts with Kierkegaard the specificity of human existence, and along with Hegel, takes the concrete man and his objective reality. Another way to put this is that classical existentialism was stuck thinking about the experience of the free individual without having the tools to understand how this freedom can be constrained and shaped by objective forces like sexism, racism, or class. Now, Sartre explores this in his second great work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is a very weird and long book that he legit wrote while mainlining amphetamines. Editor's note, if you want to write a good book of philosophy, you should not mainline amphetamines. In this book, he writes that my formalism, which is inspired by that of Marx, consists simply in recognizing that men make history to precisely the extent that it makes them. This means that relations between men are always the dialectical consequence of their activity. Now, while that might sound like it was written by someone who just snorted 11 rails of Adderall, he has a point. He's saying that, sure, humans are free to do whatever we want, but we're not free from determining material, social, and political factors. Think of it this way, like, you're allowed to listen to your podcast with no headphones on the subway, but you're not free to stop teenagers from throwing rocks at you. Rather than saying that it's an either or between radical freedom and material determinism, Sartre thinks the move is to put these things together as a part of one larger process. And in doing so, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Fanon all end up arguing for a position that's a much more socially and politically radical version of existentialism. Okay, so we've learned a lot today, but why does all of this matter? Well, if you look at early classic existentialism, you get a lot of emphasis on individual subjectivity and responsibility. You are free to change yourself however you see fit. Meanwhile, other schools of philosophy, many of which were pretty anti-existentialism, were focused on material conditions and how we could think systematically about changing the world, with individuals just being actors in that process of transformation. To put it differently, classical existentialism offers a sort of apolitical approach to existence, where I am responsible for myself and free to do what I want, which might be helpful if you're on a retreat, by yourself, staying at a cabin, in the woods, trying to do self-improvement and stuff. But it's less helpful when you come down from the mountain and have to exist in a complex and fractured society full of social and material forces pulling you in 9 different directions. And if the very folks who came up with existentialism went on to argue that their early work wasn't really adequate to deal with the complex social, political, and material reality they were engaged in, we then have to ask ourselves if we can read their earlier work without considering where their thought ended up. And further, we might need to ask ourselves what freedom really means in a world where our place of birth, skin color, or economic class radically affects on what's possible for us. But what do you guys think? We'd really love to hear about it in the comments. Also, do let us know if there's other philosophers or philosophical schools of thought that you would like to hear us talk about and break down. We want to keep making videos like this. We thank you for encouraging us to do so. So let us know so we can keep that ball rolling. And a huge shout out to our patrons. Your support means a lot. If you are interested in supporting our channel, getting videos early with no ads, you guys hate ads. You hate that we do them. I get it. But this way you don't have to watch them. And you get extra content as well, access to our Discord server. There's a link in the description. Check it out. But thank you so much to all of you for the support you give our channel by taking the time to watch our videos. Thank you for sharing them. Thank you for leaving comments, especially the weird ones. Those are fun, but it all helps us out a lot. And of course, as you know, we gotta feed that hungry algorithm. And if you want more, feel free to follow us on TikTok or Twitter. We're there too. But in the meantime, I don't know, go outside, practice some freedom, but remember that your freedom has limits. I'll see you next time. And thought, Daddy's up next. And thought, let's get married so I can have sex with you because I'm a Christian. And thought, if I were president, I would pardon you from not having sex with me. And thought, lather me with butter and put me in your oven because I'm trying to get roasted, boys.
That's where having players would be interesting. It's because I don't think my document is up to date. Which is fine. Then I don't. The story works, and for what I've put, like added to this, is actually like on theme. But see there, it says for this quest, the step number 5 needs to be unassigned, but I need to change that, I guess, to active. But then I don't remember what the other steps are. So if I change that, that's the items, and I need to do something like that. So poll. But I need to know how to start here. Poll, and then blah 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 blah, and then that's Alexis. And so I can't remember what those blah blahs are. So I need to figure out. I guess this needs to be quest entry. I have the quest entry up there. Poll opens up. So it starts with Alexis. Okay. And so maybe it was not 5, but it was. Oh. Thinking about that, there's not even 5 thingies. There's just 2. Entry 1. So that can't be right. So do we want to continue on Jean-Paul Sartre, or do we want to diverge? Nihilism, Kierkegaard, what is that? What is that? Existentialism. AI is rotten to the core. Wow, an hour 20. Maybe not. Let's go with that.
Being in Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre. Published in 1943, Being in Nothingness, a phenomenological essay on ontology, is considered a cornerstone of the philosophy of existentialism. If Nausea is his most important fictional work, this is his most famous non-fictional work. While in German prison in the 1940s, away from all the fightings, Sartre sat down and read one of the most difficult philosophical books, Martin Heidegger's magnum opus, Being in Time, in which the German philosopher settled on the idea of death giving life a meaning it lacks. In other words, to be authentically alive, one must fully realize death. So Sartre wrote his book in reaction to Heidegger, but most crucially in response to the religious notion that we are created by God. Sartre says, no, we are nothing prior to our birth or
Oh my
being.
dildo.
We are born first, and then we become something that has an essence. We
Sorry.
have no divine essence or
Yeah, I
divine
know, I'm
creator. Like a
getting
flower, we germinate, grow, and
bit of
blossom to
cold.
become a flower. But nobody plants us, we are self-made.
That's why I'm struggling
Sartre
to
also responds to the psychoanalysis movement led
to
by
find
Sigmund
motivation
Freud,
every
who
day.
argued that beneath the conscious mind there's a whole new and hidden world called the unconscious mind, where all sorts of suppressed emotions, repressed urges, and thoughts are kept. According to psychoanalysts such as Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the unconscious is a much bigger part than the conscious mind. In other words, we're only aware of a fraction of what's going on inside our minds. Sartre says that is rubbish. He argues that we do not have a hidden self floating in the unconscious cave or soup, but we are what we know. Anything we are not conscious of is not us. So Sartre agrees with René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. But unlike Descartes, Sartre doesn't believe in innate knowledge from birth. For Sartre, existence precedes essence. We are born and then we develop the self. Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher, was Sartre's teacher at one point. Husserl's philosophy, phenomenology, argues that our consciousness is always conscious of something. When we know something, an object or idea or an image. This goes back to Kant, who divided knowledge into two, the world of phenomena, which is knowable through our animal senses and perception, and noumena, which is the unknowable world of things in themselves. So phenomenology is the world of consciousness through the world of phenomena that we get to know through our senses, which removes or ignores the unknowable, such as God or afterlife, or even the psychoanalytical hidden subconscious or unconscious posited by Freud. So for Sartre, our consciousness is rooted in objects, not some divine essence or hidden unconscious. So Sartre says consciousness is tied to objects. It doesn't come from itself, neither from God. But Sartre also adds that not only consciousness allows us to be aware of the world, but consciousness is also aware of itself as a kind of transparent phenomena. Not only it's aware of objects, but simultaneously it's aware of this awareness. It knows that it knows. It's like a camera that can see, but also knows that it can see. In Being in Nothingness, Sartre starts with nothingness as the basis of existence, and then moves on to how we fill this void with societal role or fake identity. And finally, he also rejects psychoanalysis of Freud. But first, what is nothingness? To understand nothingness, let's imagine an object we call Mr. Self, who bumps into objects and obstacles like rocks in space. Through these random collisions, it shapes itself into something. Quote, nothingness carries being in its heart. To understand Sartre, let's go back to Martin Heidegger. The German philosopher said that our existence can be summed up by two ends, birth and death. So we exist in time. In other words, our life is finite, meaning we have limited time as a being. So being and time are two sides of the same coin, so to speak. One cannot separate existence from time. Sartre takes these as a starting point and then just focuses on the being itself. But instead of talking about time, he shifts his focus to nothingness. Since we have no divine essence or purpose, we exist as nothing. In other words, our nothingness makes us totally free to float around. But this nothing being has to deal with the external world, such as objects or other people, which curtail our freedom. Through our interactions with the world and other people, we have to make choices, which limits our freedom, but also causes us to feel anxiety. To escape these constraints or this limit on our freedom, we escape into our imagination, or rely on someone else for guidance, or defer authority to a figure such as God to make choices for
Yeah,
us. In
because
other
we don't
words,
want to have the
existence is
responsibility
like
of doing
walking
our
in
own
the wilderness
choices.
that is full of dangerous pitfalls, which limit our freedom. So, to escape this non freedom, we seek answers in our mind by imagining things or inventing things. This often leads us to act unconsciously or take roles in life or take refuge within an identity given to us, like nationality, job, activist, etc., like some flushed out characters in a novel. For example, I'm a YouTuber because I want to fill the void of my existence. We take on roles in order to escape our anguish for the lack of choices, but also for the abundance of choices we experience. Since we are sandwiched between an unbridled imagination or thought and tightly constrained world and regulated actions, we develop a sense of self. In other words, the self is created by free thoughts floating in nothingness, colliding with the unfree outside world of existence. Hence, we are beings in nothingness. A good analogy might be a planet. It started as a misshapen rock floating about until it lost its edges through gravity or collisions with other objects in space, and took a more spherical shape and found a stable orbit in which it can exist. Although for Sartre, humans are different because we exist, not like an object in itself, like a rock or a tree, but also exist for itself, which means we are also aware of our existence. To escape this awareness, we take a role like a teacher, which means we exist in itself. In other words, we fulfill a role, which means we exist for others, not for ourselves. But we can never fully become a thing in itself. We can only manage it for a time, and we have to convince ourselves to be a teacher, a thing in itself. In an attempt to become a teacher, a Frenchman, or a YouTuber, we try to convince ourselves to be what we are not. This is bad faith. So we come out of nothingness, but we want to be something. To fill the void, we almost fake it, which is bad faith. Bad faith for Sartre simply means living a false existence or self-deception, which is also close to a Marxist notion of false consciousness, prevalent among the working class who buy into their pride in nationalism or identity as peaceful moral citizens, or good workers, which prevent them from rebelling against an exploitative system. Marx wanted all workers to unite to overthrow the system, but they rarely did. So he blamed on false consciousness, which prevent the workers see themselves as victims. Today, another term often used is internalized racism or repression, in which one goes against their interest in accepting the status quo. For Sartre, bad faith means the negation of existence as a thing for itself. For example, when we take a role or a job, we act as if we exist for others or a thing in itself. A waiter acts as though he or she is someone whose only purpose is to wait. Could. Society demands that he limits himself to his function. There are indeed many precautions to imprison a man in what he is, as if he lived in perpetual fear that he might escape from it, that he might break away and suddenly elude his condition. In other words, their entire being is reduced to their job. This is also true in terms of social status, nationality, a fan of a sports team, etc. For Sartre, humans as sentient beings, we cannot fully become a thing in itself. So what we often do is attempt or pretend to be a teacher or a YouTuber, reducing our entire existence to one role. This is bad faith or self-deception.
Bad faith.
Why do we do it? It limits our freedom or endless choices we face in life, which is in a way a coping mechanism, because a defined role or action can calm us down. We don't have to worry about making choices or mistakes. In other words, endless freedom or choices can paralyze us. To escape bad faith, Sartre says we must accept our existence as what it is, not something that is not. An authentic person has endless choices at any moment as he or she is facing the future. But as a waiter, he or she limits it to one choice, which is inauthentic or bad faith. For Sartre, bad faith also includes social norms, moral values, religious dogmas, and legal obligations, which limit our existential journey of fulfillment as true authentic beings. While social or moral values are created by others, Sartre also considers thinking too much about our own past as bad faith. We always limit our future projections to what happened to us in the past, so this is also bad faith. If we had a bad romantic experience with one person, we project that onto future partners, which is a form of bad faith. Proust spent his entire novel talking about the past in an attempt to regain or recreate his past selves or lost time. Sartre says that is living inauthentically because you only see yourself in the past that no longer exists, not now or future. Sartre's philosophy is a teleological progressive one, similar to Hegel and Marx, that we are heading towards perfection or completion. Sartre also spends a large portion of the book talking about sex. He treats sex as a social act, not just as a biological or physical. Being for others is another form of bad faith. When we build relationship with others, we tend to limit our freedom for acceptance. Sartre gives the example of a shop mannequin that we sometimes mistake for a real person. We behave differently when we realize it's not a person. This shows how much we regulate our behavior for others depending on the kind of relationships we have. The closer, the more we curtail our own and their freedom to be for themselves rather than for others. So our purpose becomes being for others, not free existence per se. We exist to maintain the happiness of the other. For instance, you do everything to make your partner happy, which Sartre says is nothing but emotional alienation, because our entire being is taken hostage by how they make us feel and how we make them feel. So love is nothing but a bad faith conflict or a battleground for control of the other. You want them and you want them for yourself and nobody else. No wonder Sartre had an open relationship with Simone. In reality, Simone didn't exercise that freedom as much as Sartre did, which perhaps shows that men and women are different on a biological level. Men have millions of sperms ready at any moment, while women only have one egg, which dictates the level and intensity of sexual urge among the sexes. Sartre, however, rejects a biological reason for sex. Sex for Sartre is our attempt to create a completion, but upon orgasm you go back to square one. This stems from nothingness and emptiness of existence. You hike up a mountain or jump on a bungee, and at the end it's never complete. I think Sartre stretches it a bit by saying that there is no biological basis for sex. Evolution doesn't care about Sartre's opinion because he failed to procreate, so his genes died with him. But Sartre does make sex different from other basic human urges such as food and survival, because for sex to happen, you need another person, unless you go the DIY route. The third major point in being in nothingness is consciousness. For Sartre, our consciousness makes us who we are. Anything we are not conscious of or aware of is not us. This goes against the fundamental point psychoanalysts make that consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. The unconscious controls much of our choices and actions in life. According to Sartre, the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud removed the responsibility from his patient by blaming the hidden unconscious for their behavior. Sartre argues that there is a paradox in psychoanalysis that relies on patients reporting a hidden world of unconsciousness where repressed emotions are kept. You either know or don't know. If you don't know, how can you repress those emotions, urges, and ideas? Repressed emotions hidden in the unconscious is just an excuse, according to Sartre. He says if a patient has repressed certain emotions or urges and they refuse to divulge such unsavory ideas, on some level they are conscious. So the hidden unconscious theory is flawed. Pretending you don't know is self-deception for the sake of self-preservation. We lie so we can avoid responsibility. If we self-censor or hide something in our unconscious, it has to be conscious decision. You do not hide something that you do not know. We knowingly hide treasure or past mistakes. So for Sartre, the theory of the unconscious posited by Freud and Jung is nothing but an excuse to make their patients feel better about the bad choices in life. To sum up, in being in nothingness, Sartre, just like Heidegger, makes a distinction between being in itself, like an unconscious phenomena, such as a tree or rock, and being for itself, like humans. The difference is that that thing in itself exists, yet is neither aware of its existence nor has freedom, while the thing for itself is not only aware of its own existence, but also because of this consciousness, we are condemned to be free. So, Sartre's existentialism is founded upon nothingness in which existence comes about.
Much is reckoned higher than life itself by the living one. But out of the very reckoning speaketh the will to power. Thus did life once teach me, and thereby, you wisest ones, do I solve you the riddle of your hearts. Welcome to the first part of our series on the famous will to power. We will tackle this elusive Nietzschean concept in 3 parts. The first part will serve as an introduction of sorts. We'll go over Nietzsche's intellectual background, most importantly the influence of both Schopenhauer and Darwinism. We will also look at the question of interpretation. Is the will to power a metaphysical principle, or is it simply a human drive or emotion? In the second part, we will look at the concept of the will to power as it appears in Nietzsche's work itself. The will to power is notoriously vague as a concept, and throughout Nietzsche's writings, we see how the concept comes to mean different things at different times in his intellectual development. In the second part, we trace these developments through a literature study of sorts. In the third part, we will look at a contemporary interpretation of the concept in modern philosophy. It will also serve as the grand conclusion of this series. We'll see how the will to power gives Nietzsche a means of overcoming Schopenhauer's pessimism. At the end, we will hope to have given you a comprehensive overview of one of the most difficult and misunderstood ideas in philosophy. If you want to be notified when parts 2 and 3 are released, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell button. With that said, let's get started. Schopenhauer and Darwinism. Any comprehensive discussion on Nietzsche must begin with Schopenhauer. The logical place to start is Schopenhauer's idea of the will to life. As we will see, in many ways, Nietzsche's will to power was formulated as a direct competitor to Schopenhauer's will to life. We will therefore briefly go over what this concept entails. For this section, we recommend you watch our series on Schopenhauer, particularly part 1, where we go in greater detail. For Schopenhauer, the will to life is the metaphysical basis for all of reality. Behind the facade of the phenomenal world, that is to say, the material world of time and space, the world of our senses and perception, is the world as will. This ever-striving, blind, irrational will is the true nature of reality. Our material world is simply an objectification of this will. Put another way, we are the end result of the workings of this will. We are the effect, and the will is the cause. What can we say about the will? Schopenhauer, at this point in his philosophy, takes a break from metaphysical speculation and takes a look at nature. He makes 2 observations. First, life is suffering. Second, everything that exists seems to fight for its own continued existence, and often these 2 observations go hand in hand. This universal conflict becomes most distinctly visible in the animal kingdom, for animals have the whole of the vegetable kingdom for their food, and even within the animal kingdom, every beast is the prey and the food of another, for each animal can only maintain its existence by the constant destruction of some other. Thus, the will to live everywhere preys upon itself, and in different forms is its own nourishment. So, we arrive at 3 main ideas in Schopenhauer's conception of the will to life. 1. There is a metaphysical principle underpinning all of reality, the will. 2. This will is characterized by a struggle for life, or more broadly, a struggle for existence as its primary purpose. The will becomes the will to life. And 3. This struggle causes suffering, pessimism. These 3 points will be important later on. Notice the phrase struggle for life in the second point. Besides Schopenhauer, the other major development we need to discuss before moving on to Nietzsche proper is Darwinism. We always have to remember that Schopenhauer wrote down his entire philosophy some 40 years before Darwin's monumental On the Origin of Species was published. It will take another few decades before Darwin's biological theory of evolution would make its influence known in other areas of human knowledge, such as philosophy. Nietzsche in particular writes during the heyday of the philosophical movement that sought to explain everything in the natural world, even human behavior, in terms of material causes and effects. This means, however, that there is no room for metaphysical principles such as the Schopenhauerian will. After all, metaphysics, literally meaning beyond physics, cannot exist in the materialist framework advanced by Darwin and his acolytes. The struggle for life, for Schopenhauer, is the result of a metaphysical will being divided against itself through an infinite number of objectifications of itself. The struggle for life, for Darwin, is the result of limited resources and natural selection. In discussing Nietzsche's will to power, one of the main points of contention is the following question. Is the will to power a metaphysical principle, or is it a materialist explanation of behavior? Important follow-up questions include: does the will to power apply to all of reality, or is it only limited to humans, animals, or plants? As we shall see, to answer these questions is not straightforwardly simple. In fact, the answer to the questions seems to change throughout Nietzsche's own intellectual development. We will trace the development of the idea throughout Nietzsche's writings in the next part. We will see how Nietzsche's own understanding of the concept evolves, from how it appears in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, all the way to the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. Welcome to the second part in our series on Nietzsche's will to power. In the first part, we went over the literary philosophical background. We quickly reiterated the main points of Schopenhauer's concept of the will to life and the philosophical movement inspired by Darwinism that sought to explain all natural phenomena, including human behavior, from a materialist lens. Despite apparent agreements between Darwin and Schopenhauer, there is a huge point of contention between the two systems of thought. Schopenhauer advanced a metaphysical theory, while Darwin championed a materialist theory which has no need for metaphysics. As we shall see, Nietzsche struggled with this dilemma when trying to formulate his own concept of the will to power. The question that looms over the will to power, even today, is the following. Should we understand the will to power as a metaphysical concept or not? The purpose of this video is to go through Nietzsche's works in chronological order and trace the evolution of the concept of the will to power in Nietzsche's own intellectual development. The fact of the matter is that there is simply no single will to power in Nietzsche's work. A lot depends on which conception you choose to single out for discussion, because, as we will see, the concept has evolved throughout Nietzsche's thinking. The Joyful Science, a theory of power. In The Joyful Science, we see the first systematic treatment of power in Nietzsche's works. It's only one paragraph long, and Nietzsche doesn't use the term will to power yet. Rather, the paragraph is about the feeling of power, which is also the title of the paragraph in question. In it, Nietzsche describes how desires for cruelty and feelings of power are linked. Both pity and cruelty are emotions linked to the practice of power. The first, pity, signifies a lack of power, while cruelty is associated with an increase in power. But we can see how the will to power is taking root here. The first sentence is illustrative. We exercise our power over others by doing them good or by doing them ill. That is all we care for. Notice how Nietzsche is restricting himself. The feeling of power seems to be a human affair. Can animals feel power? What about plants or rocks? The feeling of power seems to be restricted to organisms with a certain degree of intelligence, presumably only humans. If we go back to the question we asked ourselves earlier, is the will to power a metaphysical concept or not? We can see how at this stage of Nietzsche's development, the answer is no. The feeling of power which Nietzsche describes here is only applicable to humans. Therefore, we are closer to Darwin than we are to Schopenhauer. We are not in metaphysical territory. Thus spoke Zarathustra. In Thus spoke Zarathustra, we see the first mention of the term will to power in Nietzsche's works. In chapter 34, we even get a definition of sorts. The will to power is the exhausted, procreating life will. Later, Zarathustra says, "Wherever I found a living thing, there found I will to power, and even in the will of the servant found I the will to be master." But the content of the concept seems to have changed in between the Joyful Science and Zarathustra. An earlier section, chapter 15, describes Zarathustra's travels through many countries, where he encounters many different peoples. What they all have in common is that each adheres to a different system of morality, of good and evil. Zarathustra remarks that the labels good and evil are simply value judgments created by man himself. Different definitions are used by different communities, yet all of them seem to flourish all the same. Zarathustra exclaims, "A table of excellencies hangeth over every people. Lo, it is the table of their triumphs. Lo, it is the voice of their will to power." Human systems of good and evil, which is to say, all systems of good and evil, are simply an expression of a stronger underlying will to power. Making a value judgment, assigning values, is a creative act and therefore an expression of the will to power, and it seems that humans cannot escape this impulse. Values that man only assign to things in order to maintain himself, therefore calleth he himself man, that is, the valuator. In Zarathustra, the will to power seems to be a decidedly human phenomenon. It is primarily concerned with value judgments and ethical systems. Man exercises his will to power
I think I am
by
right,
creating
but
values and systems of good
none of
and
you can
evil.
see it.